This is Falcon Heavy. It costs $90 million. For a mere $1 billion a year, or about 4% of NASA's budget, we could launch it to every planet in every launch window. And that is before the bulk discount. Now, one may criticize the Falcon Heavy rocket for having a short launch manifest, as it's only had 4 in 5 years. There just aren't that many commercial customers right now for the heavy lift rocket, when a cheaper Falcon 9 or another medium lift class of booster will suffice. But when one considers the more extreme cases, such as big Department of Defense missions to geostationary orbit or potential human exploration plans, the Falcon Heavy shines. And indeed, even after SLS launched, this monster still proves itself to be an engineering masterpiece, shocking NASA scientists. Find out the real reason behind this in today's episode of Alpha Tech. When it was envisioned in 2010, NASA's SLS was tipped to be the world's largest and most powerful rocket, in addition to being extraordinarily cheap and quick to build due to ample use of existing components, such as engines and boosters from the Space Shuttle program. Back then, the Starship was simply a concept, as was Falcon Heavy, the first attempt at heavy orbital vehicles undertaken by SpaceX and roughly comparable in payload capacity to the SLS. Then in 2014, NASA Administrator Charlie Bolden uttered a quote that would go on to be ridiculed and memified ever since. Let's be very honest, we don't have a commercially available heavy lift vehicle. The Falcon 9 Heavy may someday come about, it's on the drawing board right now, but SLS is real. 2 years later, in 2016, Bolden said he still did not believe commercial companies were up to the task. If you talk about launch vehicles, we believe our responsibility to the nation is to take care of things that normal people cannot do or don't want to do, like large launch vehicles, Bolden said. I'm not a big fan of commercial investment in large launch vehicles just yet. Ironically, NASA and the SLS prime contractor Boeing are no longer competing with the Falcon Heavy. SpaceX beat them too, and Falcon Heavy was launched in 2018. Meanwhile, it's not until 4 years later that SLS can even take off. But keep in mind that launch burned to a total of $23.8 billion in nominal dollars. What a shame. Since that time, a lot has changed. Bolden appears to have changed his mind. In an interview with Politico published in 2020 in the publication Space Newsletter, Bolden was asked what might happen during the next 4 years. SLS will go away, he said. It could go away during a Biden administration or a next Trump administration, because at some point commercial entities are going to catch up. They are really going to build a heavy lift launch vehicle sort of like SLS, and they will be able to fly for a much cheaper price than NASA can do SLS. That's just the way it works. Bolden remains a popular and influential voice in the space community, but he no longer has direct say in the U.S. space policy. Perhaps because he no longer has to answer to Congress for NASA budgets, he's also free to speak his mind. In any case, his comments reflect the general sentiment in the space community, at least outside of the traditional contractor like Boeing and Northrop Grumman, who directly benefit from SLS development, that the SLS rocket will eventually go away. When Congress conceived of the Space Launch System rocket in 2010 and directed NASA to build it, they were making 2 bets. First, they bet the new space companies like SpaceX would fail. It was a reasonable bet back then, as SpaceX had lost most of the rockets it tried to launch into space. And second, they bet that traditional companies like Boeing would be better at building big rockets. The congressional lawmakers who created SLS, it began with Florida Senator Bill Nelson and Texas Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson, they were soon joined by Alabama Senator Richard Shelby. Lost both of those bets. So now NASA is building a large expendable rocket that's cost taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. Congress, they remain as committed as ever, both in budget and public statement of support. However, the more that new rockets fly, the more difficult this support will be to maintain. In short, NASA's SLS rocket is probably proof of the saying, "Don't count your chickens before they hatch." Besides, there's another significant reason why NASA scientists shocked by SpaceX Falcon Heavy launch, as it's absurdly low cost. We can directly compare costs between Falcon Heavy and NASA's SLS, and upon direct comparison, the cost disparities are sobering, proving that commercial development of large rockets likely represents the future of the industry. Now, to be fair, NASA SLS will have more lift capacity than Falcon Heavy, 70 tons versus 64 tons to low Earth orbit, and a bigger fairing to accommodate flying a wider payload to space, and it'll also have a more capable upper stage that would be able to send larger payloads into deeper space. However, those improvements come at a very, very, very steep price. Consider just a single data point. NASA annually spends about $3 billion to develop the SLS and ground launch systems for the massive rocket at Kennedy Space Center. The SLS rocket was originally supposed to launch in 2017, but the maiden flight slipped all the way to 2022. That's understandable. Most large aerospace rockets experience delays. However, the cost of a 3-year delay is about $12 billion, to say the least. And for the sake of argument, consider the cost of this 3-year delay against the lift capability NASA could have bought by purchasing Falcon Heavy rockets from SpaceX. That $10 billion equates to 110 launches of the reusable Falcon Heavy, or 67 of the expendable version. This provides up to 3,800 tons of lift, the equivalent of 10 International Space Stations or one heck of a moon base. Obviously, NASA does not need that many launches, but it could buy several Falcon Heavy rockets a year and have the funds to build meaningful payloads to launch on them. In practical terms, NASA has paid nothing for the development of the Falcon Heavy rocket. In fact, by leasing its unused launch complex 39A to SpaceX for Falcon Heavy launches, the space agency said it saves about $1 million in annual maintenance cost on the historical launch complex. So the question is really, why would the government continue to spend billions of dollars a year of taxpayer money for a rocket that will be unnecessary and obsolete? Lori Garver, a deputy administrator at NASA from 2009 to 2013, shares this. If the U.S. continues this travesty, it will siphon off even more funds NASA could otherwise use for science missions, transfer vehicles, or landers that actually get us somewhere.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine full power. And liftoff of USSF 67. Go Falcon Heavy. Go Space Force.
SpaceX's fifth Falcon Heavy just lifted off shortly after sunset on the U.S. Space Force's USSF-67 mission, producing one of the massive commercial rocket's most spectacular launches yet. So, what did Elon Musk have to say about this? And what's so special about this mysterious mission anyway? Powered by 3 Falcon 9 derived boosters, each with 9 Merlin 1D engines, Falcon Heavy fired up and soared off of SpaceX's Kennedy Center LC-39A pad at the start of its Sunday launch window, producing up to 2,326 tons of thrust shortly after liftoff. Falcon Heavy upheld its position as the world's most powerful commercial rocket and the second most powerful operational rocket. USSF-67 largely mirrored SpaceX's November 1st, 2022 USSF-44 Falcon Heavy launch, and even used the same side boosters. Flying for the second time in 75 days, B-1064 and B-1065 aced their roles in the mission, separated from Falcon Heavy's expendable center booster or core around 3 minutes after liftoff. The side boosters immediately flipped around with thrusters powered by compressed nitrogen gas and ignited 3 of their 9 Merlin 1D engines to boost back to the Florida coast. After coasting back to Florida, they completed brief re-entry burns to lessen atmospheric heating and fired up one last time to gently touch down at SpaceX's LZ-1 and LZ-2 landing pads. The moment of landing is truly a sight to behold, and Musk even likened it to how we will land on Mars. Because Falcon Heavy lifted off after sunset, local skies were dark and the rocket quickly climbed back into daylight, which created a stark contrast between twilight and the bright rocket exhaust. When Falcon Heavy's side boosters flipped around and reignited, their high-velocity exhaust plumes slammed into the center core's opposing plume, producing a spectacle of an interaction and a nebula-like cloud that caught even more of the daylight. Had Falcon Heavy lifted off just a handful of minutes later, a darker sky could have made for an even more incredible nebula or jellyfish, but the rocket's first twilight launch was still spectacular. And for accompaniment, Elon Musk shared this amazing picture and said, "Falcon Heavy ascends." After both side boosters touched down, SpaceX ended its live coverage at the request of the Space Force, reiterating the mission's secretive customer and nature. SpaceX received a $316 million contract back in August of 2020 to launch USSF-67. Compared to 44, the USSF hasn't confirmed much about the USSF-67 mission's payload, but Falcon Heavy is known to be carrying a geostationary communications relay satellite called CBAS-2 and likely built by Boeing. CBAS-2 will provide communications relay capabilities in support of our senior leaders and combatant commanders, Space Force officials said in an emailed statement on Friday, January 13th. The mission of CBAS-2 is to augment existing military satellite communication capabilities and continuously broadcast military data through space-based satellite relay links. CBAS-2 is joined by Northrop Grumman's third long-duration propulsive EELV or LDPE-3A, a combination of a propulsive kickstage and a satellite. LDPE-3A is carrying a collection of rideshare satellites and payloads and is designed to operate for months in orbit. Using USSF-44 as a guide, the total USSF-67 payload could weigh roughly 3.75 to 4.75 tons, or 8,250 to 10,500 pounds. The second payload, called Long Duration Propulsive ESPA-3A, is actually a spacecraft bus. It will host 5 different smaller payloads and provide power and propulsion before dropping these vehicles into various orbits. Among these 5 payloads is a prototype crypto/interface encryption satellite that will deliver secure space-to-ground communications capability. This is a complex mission and truly represents what assured access to space is about, and is why we're so enthusiastic about this upcoming launch, our second Falcon Heavy in just months. Major General Stephen Purdy, Program Executive Officer for Assured Access to Space, said in a news release. Notably, while small compared to ordinary payloads, Falcon Heavy is launching USSF-67 directly to a geosynchronous orbit. Direct-to-GEO/GSO launches are exceptionally challenging for the rocket. Falcon Heavy must first sacrifice one of its 3 boosters just to ensure the Falcon upper stage is traveling fast enough and has enough propellant to spare when it separates. The upper stage must then conduct at least 3 or 4 burns. The first burn likely carried the upper stage and USSF-67 payload into a parking orbit around 300 kilometers above Earth's surface. A second burn of the upper stage's Merlin vacuum engine will lift the pair into a geosynchronous transfer orbit, with the low end still around 300 kilometers but the high end around 35,800 kilometers. Finally, the upper stage must survive a roughly 5-hour coast to that apogee. During that coast, the rocket must survive passes through both of the Earth's harsh radiation belts and maintain perfect control of its orientation and tank pressures to keep its refined kerosene fuel from freezing, its cryogenic liquid oxygen from boiling away, and itself from bursting as its propellant warms and expands. If it does all of these things the right way, the upper stage will be able to complete a circularization burn at apogee and deploy its CBAS-2 and LPDE-3A payloads directly into geosynchronous orbit. At GSO, satellites orbit at the same speed as Earth spins, allowing them to indefinitely hover over the same region of the planet, making it useful for Earth observations, surveillance, and communications. Finally, the Falcon upper stage will attempt to complete one last burn to send itself into a graveyard orbit just above GSO, where it will eventually run out of power and lose control. It'll take around 6 to 8 hours after liftoff before SpaceX or the USSF can confirm if the mission was a success. For years, the Falcon Heavy was the world's most powerful operational rocket, but in November, NASA's new moon rocket, the SLS, or Space Launch System, stole that title with its inaugural launch. The SLS launched the uncrewed Artemis 1 mission around the moon, paving the way for future missions with astronauts on board. While the Falcon Heavy gives off about 5 million pounds of thrust, SLS puts out as much as 8.8 million pounds of thrust, 15% more than the Saturn V rockets that powered the Apollo moon landings. But at its experimental facilities in South Texas, SpaceX is in the final stages of preparing for the first orbital launch attempt of its Starship spacecraft and Super Heavy rocket. Though the test flight still awaits final approval from federal regulators, it could lift off in the coming weeks. And if successful, SpaceX's Starship would dethrone the SLS as the most powerful rocket flying today. The Starship system is expected to outpower both the SLS and Falcon Heavy. The forthcoming Super Heavy booster, which is designed to vault the Starship spacecraft into space, is expected to put out about 17 million pounds of thrust. It's not all a competition, however, because both the SLS rocket and SpaceX's Starship are integral to NASA's plans to return astronauts to the moon's surface for the first time in half a century. SpaceX has its own ambitious vision for the Starship, which is ferrying humans and cargo to Mars in hopes of one day establishing a permanent human settlement there.
It's been a few days since SpaceX's spectacular USSF-67 Falcon Heavy rocket launch, but the echoes of that launch are still covered through newspapers, websites, and forums around the world. That's because just under 5 years after the February 2018 debut, there's still never been a Falcon Heavy launch, jellyfish, or nebula. That thankfully changed on Sunday. Indeed, from start to finish, Sunday's Falcon Heavy launch delivered spectacular moments, unlike the others. First and foremost, USSF-67 is an incredible success mission. On January 15th, SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket lifted off for the second time in 75 days to launch another batch of U.S. military payload into orbit, tens of thousands of kilometers above Earth's surface. 6.5 hours later, the U.S. Space Systems Command, SSC, confirmed that Falcon Heavy had again completed the exceptionally difficult launch without issue. To deliver the USSF-67 mission payloads directly to the geosynchronous orbit, GSO, the giant SpaceX rocket had to sacrifice one of its potentially reusable boosters and complete a 6-hour ballet of rolls, burns, and spacecraft deployments. And for the second time in a row, Falcon Heavy did so without apparent issue. In an SSC press release, Major General Stephen Purdy, Program Executive Officer for Assured Access to Space, said that the group had another fantastic launch today on Falcon Heavy. He added that while the launch itself was impressive, he was most proud of the fact that we placed an important national capability into space. And an impressive launch, it certainly was. USSF-67 was Falcon Heavy's first twilight launch. The extraordinary cadence of SpaceX's workhorse Falcon 9 rocket, which Falcon Heavy is derived from, caused twilight launches and the incredible light shows they can produce to become a fairly routine phenomenon. And finally, after 5 years, it happened in this picture. The rocket lifted off just 10 or so minutes after sunset and soared into the fading purple skies. Those skies were still relatively bright at ground level, reducing the amount of contrast, but the resulting light show was still spectacular as Falcon Heavy and its immense exhaust plume ascended back into the sunlight. The artificial sunrise that lit up the pillar-like plume with the colors of sunrise and eventually bright daylight. Close-up views enabled by tracking telescopes captured the true drama, which began shortly after Falcon Heavy's twin side boosters separated from the rocket's main core stage and upper stage, flipped around, and ignited the engines to fly back to the Florida coast they'd just lifted off from. As the 9-engine center core continued toward space, each booster fired up 1 and then 3 Merlin 1D engines for their boost-back burns. In this image, the center core can be seen burning toward orbit with the USSF-67 payload. In the meantime, the side boosters are firing to begin the return to Earth. This maneuvering is complicated during a Falcon Heavy by interactions with the center core plume. During a Falcon 9 launch, of course, there would be just a single Merlin vacuum engine powering the second stage at that time. After slowing down for the return to Earth, the side boosters perform a near-continuous series of coal gas thruster firings. These nitrogen-powered thrusters help keep the rockets in proper orientation as they descend toward the planet, and they survive re-entry through Earth's atmosphere. Now, the second most powerful rocket in the world after NASA's Space Launch System, the Falcon Heavy always puts on a great show with its 27 Merlin engines firing at once. It holds the record for the rocket with the most first-stage engines to reach orbit, at least it will until SpaceX's Starship rocket flies later this year. If you missed this launch of the Falcon Heavy rocket, don't despair. For Falcon Heavy side boosters B-1064 and 1065, both of which supporting USSF-44 and USSF-67, their missions are far from over. Their second successful side-by-side landing has cleared the boosters to be reused on a third military launch called USSF-52. Originally known as AFSPC-52, the mission was Falcon Heavy's first operational U.S. military launch contract and the first time the rocket beat competitor United Launch Alliance ULA during a competitive procurement. USSF-52 is scheduled to launch no earlier than April 10, 2023, less than 3 months from now. Once that mission is complete, Falcon Heavy will have no more U.S. military missions on contract, although more will almost certainly be rewarded sooner than later. USSF-52 is sandwiched between two other Falcon Heavy launches. Falcon Heavy could launch the Viasat-3 communication satellite as early as March 2023, and the Jupiter 3 EchoStar 24 communication satellite as early as May 2023, and that makes for a busy 90 days. NASA's robotic Psyche asteroid explorer is slated to depart Earth on Falcon Heavy rockets during a launch period opening October 10th. The Psyche mission, delayed from 2022, will enter orbit around the metal-rich asteroid Psyche in 2029. SpaceX has a backload of 12 Falcon Heavy missions over the next few years, including the 5 launches planned in 2023. The rocket, boasting 3 reusable boosters, is the second most powerful operating launch vehicle in the world after Boeing's Space Launch System debuted last year, but it cost about 10 times less. Falcon Heavy USSF-67 sent the most important satellites used by the U.S. military to coordinate its forces around the globe live in high orbit some 27,000 miles above the Earth. It's difficult to get there by design that keeps the satellites safe from attacks from the ground. And right now, only SpaceX's Falcon Heavy can deliver those big satellites to geostationary orbits. The SLS is way too expensive. Boeing retired the Delta IV rocket that used to do the job, and the United Launch Alliance Vulcan rocket still has yet to fly, though it's expected to do so later this year. For the foreseeable future, then, the U.S. military is dependent on SpaceX for heavy lifts, and SpaceX is taking advantage. While its first Falcon Heavy launch for the U.S. military in 2019 cost just $130 billion, this mission is a cost of $316 million. Inflation and the complexity of the mission are part of the reason for the increase, but the other part is simply what a one-provider market can bear. Now SpaceX is seeking $750 million in new capital at a reported valuation of $137 billion. That comes after Elon Musk's space conglomerate took in $250 million from investors in 2022 and $1.5 billion in 2021. SpaceX is almost like a sovereign entity in their ability to raise capital endlessly, says Chris Quilty, a space industry expert. The reason wouldn't surprise Peter Thiel, the SpaceX investor and Musk collaborator, who's argued that the best business model is a monopoly. SpaceX dominates most sectors it plays in, but in a few, human spaceflight and launching large satellites, it's the only game in town. Investors are handing Musk their money to fund ambitious projects like Starlink, the company's satellite network, and Starship, its next rocket. More on that later. But one reason they feel they can secure betting on those frontier technologies is how reliant the U.S. government is on SpaceX. That just about wraps it up for today's episode. Don't forget, share your ideas in the comments section down below. Your support motivates us to create more quality video. And for that, we thank you so much and hope to see you next time.